Earlier, I spoke to Mark Weisbrot, who is the co-director and co-founder of the Center for Economic Policy Research here in Washington, D.C., and I asked him what the impact would be of President Xi's visit to Latin America.
Well, obviously, trade has expanded enormously. I mean, Brazil and Chile, China is their biggest trade partner, and other countries too. And it's very beneficial for Latin America, obviously, the trade, the investment. But something I think that hasn't gotten as much attention is finance. You know, some countries have borrowed, Venezuela, Ecuador, other countries have borrowed as well. And I think that this is something where China can really help the region a lot because, you know, China has a lot of reserves.
They have a lot of money, basically.
Over
Latin America wants to borrow the money.
Well, there will be countries that will, you know, at times need it. You know, Latin America has gone through a huge transformation in the last 15 years. It used to be very much dependent on the United States, and even their economic policy was very often determined by the United States, by the IMF. And now they're independent. South America is more independent of the United States than Europe is. And that only took place over the last 10, 15 years. And so China has played an important role in that process by providing, even through a market for their goods, obviously, because the U.S. market didn't grow as much as it used to, and investment, and also finance. And I think finance is important because you look at countries like Venezuela and Argentina, for example, you know, they run into certain balance of payments constraints, and Argentina can't borrow on world markets, for example.
There's been a lot of press on the fact that China is investing in Latin America. A lot of the big part of that reason is because of the commodities that's available in that region. Are there other industries that China is also looking at in terms of opportunities for Latin America?
Well, I think there are, but you have to remember, you know, Latin America, because it's only recently become more independent, is only recently returning to the kind of development strategies that, or, you know, promotion of industry, for example, that, you know, you've had in China for the last 30 years. And that's why China's been the fastest growing country in the world, partly because you have you've had very strong industrial policies, investment policies, and development policy. All of these were wiped out because, you know, in Latin America, they had this in the 60s and the 70s, but then beginning in the 80s, they shifted to this neoliberal set of policies. They destroyed a lot of their industry, actually, in some countries. And so that is now, they're first now beginning to, you know, return to development planning. And that's where you're going to see different kinds of trade, I think.
If you were advising, you know, President Xi, you know, he's coming to the neighborhood, he's going to be looking at these investments, and obviously that's going to be a very big topic of growing that relationship between China and Latin America. What more should or does China need to do to grow that relationship? For
China, China has an interest in helping these countries maintain their independence and become more independent. Look at the little Caribbean nations, for example. Look at Jamaica. They're paying 10% of their GDP in interest on their debt. This is worse than the entire world. Okay, they need alternative sources of financing, especially, and all the countries could use. You know, the IMF set up a flexible credit line, for example, and only gave it to 3 countries, the ones that are closest to the United States. And China could do, and the BRICS countries especially together.
So I mean, just hearing our discussion, it sounds like there's fairly big opportunities for China to not only invest in the Latin America countries, but really act sort of like a pseudo bank in terms of financing infrastructure projects or any other major government projects, and continue to grow that relationship, because ultimately I'm assuming both sides would benefit from this relationship.
Absolutely. I think they would.
Do you think that the Latin America countries, when you look at individual sectors of the economy, is it more from the government standpoint that there's this demand to build that relationship, or is it coming from the private sector?
Well, I think it's both. But I think the governments are, as I said, as they're moving more towards returning to some economic planning. They're moving slowly in that direction. They want these kind of trade relationships. And you know, the trade relationships and investment relations with China, they don't come with the same kind of strings. I mean, look at the free trade agreements, so-called free trade agreements that countries have with the United States. They give corporations the right to sue these governments. They give the pharmaceutical companies in the United States and the rich countries special privileges. So China is not demanding these things. China doesn't put conditions on their financing, their trade, or their investment. And that, I think, is the biggest advantage and why you've seen so much movement in that direction.
That was Mark Weisbot.